All right, folks. We appreciate your patience. We were waiting a few minutes to make sure everybody who was able to get here was able to actually get here in the traffic. We want to appreciate everybody who's come tonight, and for sure we want to thank from the Division of Historical Resources, we have Megan McDonald. She's our Certified Local Government Program Coordinator, and Max Eberman, he's the National Register Reviewer. Now we have Micanopy here. We have Gainesville represented here. I didn't get a chance to meet you, sir. Where are you from? What organization are you with? The Gainesville Historical Preservation. We have members of the Newberry Planning and Zoning Board here tonight, and we also have members of the Main Street organization here tonight. So, and the Architectural Review Board as well. So we appreciate you guys traveling down from Tallahassee. The way I understand it is you guys are on your first stop of a statewide journey. So we're going to be the guinea pigs for them tonight. So asking them lots of questions, and we'll hone their skills as they move on with this. We have been trying to schedule this for quite some time. So with that, I will let you guys come on up and get started and train us away, because we all have historical structures in our cities that we really want to try to protect.
All right, well, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for coming out, especially those of you who traveled far to be here. Like he just said, my name is Megan McDonald, and I'm the Certified Local Government Coordinator for the state of Florida. If you're not sure what that is, I will tell you about that momentarily. And then Max Eberman is here, who is a National Register Reviewer, so he'll be able to answer any of your questions about the National Register of Historic Places and the process of nominating a property or a district to the National Register. But today what we're going to do is we're going to basically do a crash course in historic preservation. We've broken it into 3 little segments. And we'll do questions at the end of each of the segments, and we will have a break shortly before the last segment for everyone to have some snacks and all that. If you haven't gotten a chance, we have all kinds of goodies from the Division of Historical Resources in the back, so take what you like, and we have extra handouts if you want them. But to get started, I wanted to frame our conversation with a quote from a kind of a go-to historic preservation textbook, which is called A Richer Heritage, Historic Preservation in the 21st Century. And it reads, "Preservation in America is about nurturing the grassroots and assisting communities with the preservation of physical structures, objects, and settings that tell the story of our collective experience." And I chose this quote to start our presentation for 2 main reasons. The first is that element of the grassroots. Historic preservation historically has begun in the grassroots level, on the local level, and that's really where preservation takes place in a meaningful way. So today we're going to talk a lot about what we do on a local level to preserve historic resources. And then the second piece is that aspect of how historic resources tell stories and how they tell stories of our collective experience. A lot of times we get hung up on preserving historic resources because they're pretty or because they're old, but it's really about what they tell us about our collective experience as humans. So with that, we're just going to run through some examples just to kind of get our brains going. Examples of resources that we preserve. The first, we'll start way back. Here we have the Lake Jackson Mounds Archaeological State Park, which is on the National Register. This park at one point had 7 Native American mounds that were built by the Fort Walton culture between the years 1000 and 1500. And these tell us about those who were here before European settlement. Because these mounds are preserved, we get to see physical, tangible evidence of those who came before us. Here we have the African Burial Ground National Monument in New York City, and what you see on the screen here is actually a small portion of what was once a much larger burial ground that was actually forgotten about for several hundred years. There were believed to have been at least 10,000 African Americans, both slave and free, that were buried on this site. They didn't have headstones, and over time they were forgotten about and covered in fill, covered in buildings, and they weren't discovered until 1991 when a federal project was being constructed on the site and they found the remains. And so when they were found, they did a lot of archaeological excavation. They readjusted the building that was going to be on the site to protect what was left, and then they built this monument that you see on the screen so that their memory would not be forgotten. We preserve structures and resources that remind us of important figures in larger patterns of our history. So here we have the Martin Martin Luther King Jr. birth home in Atlanta, Georgia. And not only is this house on a national register and locally protected, but it's in a larger district. So when you walk down this street, everything is preserved as it looked when Martin Luther King Jr. was a child. So you get to kind of have that sense of feeling of where he grew up and his formative years and what led him to be the man that he was. We preserve monuments and works of art. On the left, we have the Monument of States, which is in Kissimmee here in Florida. And I'm new to Florida, but I thought this was fascinating, that shortly after the attacks on Pearl Harbor, the folks in this community really wanted to make a show of unity, and so they collected these stones from all 48 states at the time and from all over the world, and they created this monument to just show that they were a united front and that they were in it together. And then on the right-hand side, this is a bronze sculpture called Life, and it's actually in a larger park in Jacksonville, Memorial Park. And this entire park was created to memorialize the lives of the 1,200 Floridians that died during World War I. So we preserve places like these. We preserve the unusual. This is Coral Castle near Homestead, Florida, and it is on the National Register. There's a lot of myth and mystery about how one man did this in 28 years with no help and no machinery. It's a modern mystery. We don't know. We also preserve pieces of our infrastructure, and we preserve things that show technological advancement in our society. So here we have the overseas highway that led to the Florida Keys, and even though it's still not used for transportation necessarily, we keep it as a reminder of our past. I might pronounce this wrong. Is it Cadazan? Cadazan. We have Cadazan, which is one of the Ringling Brothers' homes in Sarasota. We keep homes of all kinds. We keep homes that are architectural wonders that represent the lives of the rich and the powerful. But we also need to make an effort to preserve the homes and residences and the memories of people who are representing the working class and the middle class, because their memory is just as important as those of other social classes. We preserve places that are associated with important events in our history. So here we have in the background there is what is normally called the grassy knoll, but the entire area is called Dealey Plaza. And actually what's interesting about this site is not only what you see in the picture preserved, but there are at least a dozen buildings surrounding this site that are preserved, so that when you come to visit this site, you're taken to exactly what it looked like when JFK cruised through here in his convertible. We preserve districts for multiple reasons. Here we have an example in Miami Beach of a district that we preserve for its architectural history. Having one of these buildings preserved would certainly be significant, but when you see them all together in that block, they tell a much more fuller picture of a particular period of time. And then, of course, there's your typical, well, there's no typical, but your main street or your downtown. So this is Rome, Georgia, where I used to live. And what you can see in this picture, in the very front, you can see the edge of the commercial district. You can see those church steeples and houses of worship scattered throughout. There's a school in the background, and then, of course, there's the residences. When we preserve districts and we try to keep them intact, we're able to see a picture of how a community has evolved over time. So that's really one of the benefits of having a district. All right, so we've talked about the types of places we preserve. Why do we preserve? So we've kind of touched on these first 2 points. We preserve to have a sense of history and to remember our values and to maintain a sense of place. And then there's also very practical reasons that we preserve. There are economic benefits to preserving resources. They help property values. They create jobs. They can inspire heritage tourism. They are pieces of education that can be utilized. And then, of course, sustainability. You've probably heard this said that the greenest building is the one that's already been built. That is very true, and historic buildings can be an aspect of sustainability. So I'm going to run through a couple of slides about how we preserve from a governmental perspective, just to kind of give us a background. So in 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act was passed, and this is what created preservation policy at the national level. It created the state historic preservation offices. So in Florida, that's the Division of Historical Resources where Max and myself work. It created the National Register of Historic Places, which Max is going to talk about shortly. and it also established a basis for a criteria for evaluating buildings for historic significance. It created the Historic Preservation Fund, and that is where some of the money comes from for our state grants. So if you've ever if your community has ever earned a grant for survey, design guidelines, National Register nominations, or education projects, that very well may have come from the Historic Preservation Fund. And then the National Historic Preservation Act also created a detailed process for review of federally funded, permitted, or administered projects, and that's generally referred to as Section 106. So I just wanted to give you a very brief introduction to what we do at the Florida Division of Historical Resources, and I highly recommend that you visit the website that I have on this slide here if you want to learn more about these programs, although I'm sure you're familiar with some. I know we have at least one member of the local Main Street community here. The Florida Main Street community is operated out of our office. I saw that you have a state historical marker out front of this building. That is also administered through our office. We have the Florida Folklife Program, the National Register Program. The Certified Local Government Program does not have a snazzy logo, so the photo on the bottom left is of a training at a Certified Local Government event. The Florida Master Site File is basically like our inventory of historic resources in the state, housed in our office, our grants program, and then also Section 106. And again, if you want to learn more about any of these programs, you can feel free to check our website. So historic preservation law in Florida. So Section 267 of the Florida statutes is really where the authority comes from for us to establish local historic preservation commissions and local ordinances. It was originally passed in 1967 and edited in 2001. And this is also the ruling that gives the Division of Historical Resources responsibility for coordinating historic preservation efforts in the state. It also established the Florida Historical Commission. So again, if your community's ever applied for a grant and it went before the grant panel, the members of that grant panel are on the Florida Historical Commission. Similarly, the folks who are on our National Register Review Board are also members of the Florida Historical Commission, and they are appointed by the governor and I believe 2 or 3 other politicians, and it's a group that participates in a number of our programs. Section 267 created the Historic Preservation Grant Program, the State Marker Program, and others, and it requires review of projects in line with Section 106. All right, so now we're going to kind of refocus on the local level because that's where you guys are all involved. So every community that is a certified local government, which I will get into, has passed a pretty thorough historic preservation ordinance. And if you're a member of a historic preservation commission, I highly recommend that you read your local historic preservation ordinance, because this document is what dictates what you can designate in your community and the criteria that you use to designate it. And it also outlines procedures for how you handle National Register nominations, and then how you do design review, which is what is going to be the last section of our presentation, what that will focus on. Local preservation ordinances are designed to protect historic resources. That is their function, and that is the same function of the Historic Preservation Commission. And they also exist to manage change. It doesn't exist to prevent change, because if we want historic resources to survive, we have to find adaptive strategies to use them in the future. All right, so I've kind of talked about this a little bit, but the role of the Historic Preservation Commission is to identify and designate local resources, to conduct design review, to promote public awareness of historic resources, to review National Register nominations, and that is particularly for those historic preservation commissions that are certified local governments. That's actually a requirement of the program. So whenever a property in your jurisdiction is being nominated for the National Register, it's your Historic Preservation Commission's job to review it to make sure that you agree that it should be nominated before it comes to the state. And then Historic Preservation Commissions are also tasked with maintaining an ongoing system of survey and inventory. We consider buildings that are 50 years or older to be historic. So every year, more properties are considered historic. So ongoing inventory is really important, particularly now. Folks are really focusing on those mid-century modern resources, which are now becoming historic. All right, so I've touched on this first item here, but As a Historic Preservation Commission member, and I should say that every community calls their commission something different. So here it's an architectural review board. Other communities it's a historic preservation board. There's all kinds, I think there's one community that's a historic and environmental preservation board. There's many names, but I'm gonna stick with Historic Preservation Commission for the sake of consistency. But it's really important that you understand your ordinance and how historic designation works in your community so that you're prepared when folks come before your board. If your community has design guidelines, and we will talk about that a little bit later, but design guidelines really expand upon the criteria in your ordinance, and it gives owners of historic properties tools and information about how they should be rehabilitating their home, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate in terms of rehabilitating. So if you have design guidelines, you should certainly be familiar with them. If your community has a historic preservation element as a part of your comprehensive plan, you should be familiar with that and the goals that were set forth in it. You should know your historic resources. You live here, you probably are fairly aware of the historic resources in your community. But I'm not just talking about those that are locally designated. You should also be kind of actively having an attitude of looking around you and surveying to see potentially historic resources that you might not have previously thought were historic. So that was kind of one of the reasons I went through all those examples in the beginning. You may not think of a bridge as something that should be worthy of preservation or that should be locally protected, but keeping an active eye out for historic resources that could be protected by your commission. You should know the properties that are listed on the National Register, and also you should have some sort of awareness of your archaeological sites. Know your community. You are the best in the best position as residents of your communities to know how your community views historic preservation, what their attitude is towards it, what they're willing to accept, and so on and so forth. And if there are local historic preservation advocacy groups in your community, you should definitely be in conversation with them about how you can partner and the ways in which you can promote historic preservation as a united front. And then lastly, know and promote incentives. There need to be more incentives everywhere for historic preservation. But you should have some awareness of if there are local grant programs, if there are local revolving funds that can help people to pay for the rehabilitation of their buildings. Or if maybe there are awards programs. I was reading a thread with the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions this past week that was all about facade reimbursement programs. And basically it was a way that a number of local communities reward people for doing really good historic preservation work on primarily downtown commercial buildings. But knowing those incentives, having ways that you can suggest to people who come before your board to help them accomplish their goals and to do so in an appropriate manner are very important. So the Certified Local Government Program, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what it is. Basically, if a community has a historic preservation ordinance, they have a historic preservation commission, they are eligible to become a certified local government. So not every community that has a historic preservation commission is a certified local government. In order to become the certified local government, which I'll call CLG from here on out, you need to meet specific guidelines in your ordinance. We want them to be pretty detailed, pretty in-depth, to make sure that they're really going to be effective. You have to pass our review. You have to submit an application. You have to have a historic preservation commission that's actively meeting at least 4 times a year. You do not necessarily have to have locally designated sites. We have a number of CLGs that don't. And once you submit an application to the state, if we feel that you've done everything that meets our guidelines, we pass it to the National Park Service. The National Park Service then certifies you. It's a pretty simple, straightforward process. And those of you from Newberry, Micanopy, and Gainesville, you've already gone through it. And so you're certified local governments. And the reason that communities become certified local governments there's a couple of reasons. First, you become eligible for training and technical assistance from the state. Second, you are eligible for the federal pass-through grant money that I mentioned earlier from the Historic Preservation Fund. So those, the federal money can be used for survey, National Register nominations, planning, and educational materials. The secondary benefit with grants is that for CLGs and for Main Streets, the match is waived. Ordinarily, you have to match the grant funds But if you're a CLG or a Main Street, you do not. Some still choose to do so because it's a large project and they want to have additional funding, but that is waived if you so choose. And then lastly, another benefit of the CLG program that I really can't overemphasize is the networking opportunities that you have through our listserv, through our trainings, to work with other communities that are certified local governments, to kind of bounce ideas off of each other, to share resources. And folks do that regularly through our listserv, and I think that that's been really helpful for folks. And then lastly, I just wanted to point to some cool grant projects that CLGs have done, and 2 of them up here I just realized are from Gainesville, so good job. On the top right, we have Gainesville's Mid-Century Design Guidelines. I actually have it here. This is very impressive. Like I said, it's because we continue to evaluate properties that are 50 years and older. Those mid-century properties are what we're surveying now. And so this is a really in-depth guidebook about how to take care of mid-century resources, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, what materials were being used when those structures were built. And then actually, University of Florida also did a mid-century modern architecture booklet, and this was statewide, which was a pretty impressive document. In the bottom middle, you can see the historic marker. This is actually in St. Augustine. And they used grant funds to make a wayfinding app for your phone. So the little box underneath the plaque is a QR code that you scan with your phone. And so these are underneath, I think it was at least 50 of these plaques around the city. You could scan it, it would take you to an app, and you'd get to learn all about that property. And that was considered an educational material small matching grant. And then on the bottom right, St. Petersburg made a downtown and waterfront walking tour guide. So there's all kinds of ways to utilize the small matching grant funding. And then I should also mention that we also have special category grants. There's really no benefit to being a CLG when applying for them because they don't require, do they require a match? I don't think they require a match, but don't quote me. Check it on the website. They do require a match. Okay. And over 50,000. Okay, and those projects are largely focused on rehabilitation of historic structures. So if you're interested in trying to obtain grant funding for a historic structure, I recommend that you look at our website to look at that. But with that, I've done a lot of talking very quickly to give you a little background on historic preservation. And so I'm going to turn it over to Max, who's going to talk about the National Register. But I guess I should see if any of you have questions first about what we just went over. Yes.
So you mentioned here somewhere, they would call it heritage tourism.
Sure.
Are you seeing that increasing or dwindling, or are you seeing trends there?
I definitely see it increasing. I think that a lot of these historic downtowns that are starting to see a revitalization, they're kind of banking on the draw that brings both to downtown businesses, but also, I mean, folks just, there just does seem to be a revitalization in terms of people being interested in the historic resources. And I think Main Street is kind of a testament to that and the success of that program, but definitely increasing. Any other questions for me? All right, I'm going to turn it over to Max.
Hello, good evening. So I'm Max Zimmerman. I work with Megan. I work in the survey and registration section, which we have 2 parts. We administer surveys of the state's historic resources, and we register them, which in our case is the National Register of Historic Places. So I'm sure a lot of you have entered a historic property, seen a plaque on the wall, and that indicates that the place is on the National Register. Well, I'm here today to kind of try and demystify it, try and teach you all what that means, what that does, what that doesn't do, and how you can get more resources listed on the National Register. So, let me pick this up. The first question is, what does the National Register do for a property? It does basically 4 things. First, it's just a list of places that are considered important to some degree at the local, state, or national level. Can a story be told about the place that in many different types of significance? And it's easily searchable online. You can go on Wikipedia, and in the state of Florida, there are people who, whenever something gets listed, they create a page for it, which includes a lot of information based on the National Register nominations. So it's accessible information. It's designed to be a searchable format. You can also search for it on the National Park Service website. The second thing is, and the most impactful thing, is that the National Register is a tool that is used to evaluate whether or not federally and some state-funded government projects will impact negatively historic resources. We're not going to get too much in the weeds on that, but essentially what it does is whenever there's a governmentally funded project, they will do a survey and see what resources are being impacted, and they will determine whether or not the impact will be negative, and they'll try and mitigate that impact somehow. It doesn't stop the project most of the time, but they'll try and work around it as best they can. The third benefit is that for certain properties that are on the National Register, if they're being rehabilitated in a way to further boost its economic potential, you can get tax credits on that project, on that rehabilitation. And the fourth part is, as Megan said, if you're on the National Register, you get a certain small bonus to receiving state historic preservation grants. Now, a lot of people are nervous about the National Register because they think it's going to prevent them from making changes to their properties. But I'm here to tell you, it does not do that. You do not have to keep your property exactly the same. Something can be put on the National Register and then knocked down the next day. Last year, we put a WPA building built in the 1930s on the National Register in Tallahassee. Within a month, it was demolished. And when we listed it, we knew it was going to be demolished. So we cannot stop these things. It's just about providing honor and recognition, basically a history paper about these properties so that they'll be remembered in some way with photographs forever. You're not obligated to let the public onto your property if it's on the National Register. There's tons and tons and tons of private homes on the NR, and you do not have to turn them into museums, though many of them are. And being on the NR does not make you more likely to be purchased by the government. You'll probably keep your property, and it will remain in your private hands. Now, let's go through a brief version of what makes something National Register eligible. What I always say to people is that to get something on the National Register, you have to be half lawyer, half detective. There's a lot of rules that determine whether or not something can be on the National Register. There's 4 different criteria that we use. There's 7 different aspects of integrity that we use to determine whether or not it can be listed. I'm not going to get into that, but it's complicated. So that's the lawyer part. And the detective part is the type of research that you do to kind of tell the stories. So let's get into these 3 different categories here. First, age. Is the resource at least 50 years old? Any resource that's 50 years old is considered historic. That's kind of the definition, the colloquial definition of historic. 50 years old is historic. So that's the first check. Though things that are less than 50 years old can be listed if they are exceptionally significant, which again is a nebulous, that's where the lawyer comes in. You try to make the case that it's exceptionally significant. Oftentimes this comes down to, have there been academic papers that address it? So, for instance, Dulles Airport was, I think, listed 10 or 15 years after it was built. That's a very significant airport in terms of its design. It didn't have to be 50 to be listed. The second part is significance. Is the resource associated with events, people, or design principles that have had some sort of impact on history at the local, state, or national level? This is the detective and the lawyer, right? You can do research, or you can do oral interviews, or you can just kind of talk about local lore to tell the story of how something is important and make the case that it is. As long as the story can be told, something can be listed if the story is told well. And the last part is integrity. Does the resource basically look how it looked in the period when it was considered important? So if you're saying that a house was significant in the year 1960, if it looks similar to how it did in 1960, it has a good chance of being eligible for listing. But if it has had significant changes of some sort, it hurts that case. But never say never. That's where, again, the lawyer comes in. There's always ways to try and circumvent these concerns that people could have about it. So it's the combination of these 3 factors that determines whether or not something can or can't be listed. So these are 6 different properties that we've had listed in the last couple of years. I just put these up to, and Megan has talked about some of these, but I want to show the kind of the different types of resources that we can. You can have a park, a building, a house, mid-century modern. You can have a cemetery, an above-ground Bohemian cemetery. In the middle and the bottom, we have the Mound House in Fort Myers Beach, which was actually built on an ancient Calusa mound, but it's a 1920s bungalow and craftsman building. In the bottom right, we have the Coconut Grove Playhouse in Miami, which is a Mediterranean Revival playhouse where they first premiered Waiting for Godot in the United States. So just want to show the wide variety. It's not all, Mount Vernon's or things there. It's just as long as the story can be told. So here, I pulled up here 2 different properties that we have in Newberry that were identified on a survey done last year that have not been currently listed on the National Register. They're outside of these 2 districts that you have in town. The first one is here at 24500 Dock Corrales Drive, and built in 1958. This is a very funky building. Megan and I talked about it quite a bit. It's a round, organic-style building. It's an office building. I think it's the east side of town. And it's meant to convey natural themes with a stucco facade. Something like this, based on the survey, they did not find any significant events or people associated with it, but the architecture is a rare style for Florida, and it's interesting. Something like this could be listed. Another one is the Newberry Church of Christ, built in 1950 at 25045 West Newberry Road. This one is a rectangular contemporary style building, and it has many of the characteristic features of that style with peaked gables, decorative concrete screen block, and minimal ornamentation. Again, there could be significant events that happened here with its use of the church that would help you get it listed, but just based on the architecture alone, it could be listed, and it's outside of that district. So let's quickly go through the listing process. The SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, is at the heart of this. We're the facilitators of the NR listing process, but it comes from the ground up. So essentially, any applicant can submit what we call a preliminary site information questionnaire to our office. That questionnaire is a short application where you write, what is the building, what does it look like, and why do you think it's important, and send us some current photographs, and if you have them, historic photographs. And we'll use those to determine whether or not there are enough leads there for someone to make a case that it is significant and has integrity. The second part is that we make that determination, and then if we make a positive or negative decision on that, we'll let you guys know. If it's negative, you can disagree with us, and you can do it anyways, but normally that's not the best idea. But once the nomination is prepared, it's usually a partnership between the local and the state level, or whatever actors, or if the grant is received, consultant, a nomination is prepared and submitted to us. We'll edit it. We'll send it back to the CLG, so you guys would receive it. You get to look at it, vote on it to see whether or not your local boards approve the nomination, if you'd want any changes. Send it back to us. We present to our state review board, which is a collection of 5 professionals in the field. On our board right now, we have a historian, an architectural historian, an architect, and 2 archaeologists. So they kind of confer and they see whether or not the application aptly conveys the significance and integrity of the building in a way that justifies it under the strict rules that we have to abide by. If they approve of it, we often have to do some sort of edits, but once we edit it, we send it up to National Park Service, and then our reviewer will make a decision on that, and then it's listed or it's not listed. So that's the process. It comes from the ground up.
How many applications a year do
We
you receive?
receive probably 30 to 40 from the public, and we generally do maybe 30 or so each year. I think it's like around 7 or 8 per meeting on average at this time. But we're not overly swamped. I think we would like to be. We've had a bit of an increase, and a lot of that comes down to public engagement. So I'm going to get to this at the end, what we would like from you all out there. But we would love to be seeing more stuff from CLGs, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Yes, go on.
Okay. So the National Register is under the National Park Service if we're looking at the government?
Correct. The National Park Service administers the program, and they set all the guidelines, and they make all the judgments. And our state office kind of is the local agents that help get things up to them. Will you raise your hand?
Yes, I do. Aren't there different levels of categories that we can get in with match, like local significance or joint significance?
Right, yes. Local, state, national are the 3 levels of significance, but one isn't necessarily better than the other. You'll receive the same protections as local, state, or national. Something that's nationally important isn't necessarily more important than something that's locally important. but it's just important to a wider set of people. Mhm. Right. So that does happen always. Everyone would always like it to be as highly sold as possible. So we do sometimes receive people hoping to upgrade them, as you're saying. Oh, one other thing I would like to say is to really point out that, as I've been saying, the National Register listing doesn't prevent property owners from making changes to their properties. So I always try and sell that. Part of my job is to try and sell the National Register program to the public. So I always say, well, it doesn't really do anything in that way. So it's the local boards who make the decisions that really lock things in. You guys are the real agents of preservation in the country and in the state. So I just want to point that out, that the National Register program has the word national in it, which makes it seem like it's more important, but a lot of things in the United States are really most impactful at the local level. So the next thing is, so here's what I was just talking about. What would we like you guys to do for us or to send to us? So one thing is, we've received recently some great surveys of local resource types. What those do is we can basically create projects based on that. So we've received recently, as Megan had up, the Florida Mid-Century Survey, also a Gainesville Mid-Century Survey. Based on that, we could determine what things are eligible and try and do that. So if you ever have any extra money or want to apply for a grant to do a survey of a local type, a local common type, or maybe certain types of resources along a certain main street or anything, those types of surveys can be very useful in forcing us to do more type of work that would benefit your communities. Another thing is, if you all ever do any local listings, to send them to our office, to Megan, or to anyone in our section. The process of converting a local designation to a National Register designation is not too onerous. It'd be very efficient if CLGs would always send us their listings, because we could kind of funnel it up in that way and get a lot of stuff done quickly and efficiently, and then the people would already be aware of it. Another thing is, send us PSIQs. You guys know your communities much better than we do. We're up in Tallahassee. We're trapped the rest of the time. We don't usually get to go on these trips like this, so this is a real pleasure, but we don't get to see the state as much as we would like. So you send us PSIQs. Let us know about things. And the last thing is to really, yes? Oh, I think I talked about that in the beginning, but that's a preliminary site information questionnaire. That's the form I was talking about that sort of is how we determine whether or not we believe something could be listed on the National Register. Sorry about that. And the last thing is, as many of you do already, just we'll keep working with your local historians and nonprofits to identify and list your resources.
Is there a form that you have, like if you're getting ready to do a survey, is there a template or a form that y'all keep that you would share? Or you can kind of adjust for whatever you.
There isn't so much a template. There's a certain set of requirements that are required for government-initiated surveys that would be best for y'all to stick to. So if you're ever doing a survey, you can contact our office and let us know. We can send those to you. So that's my contact information. If anyone who has a folder, I've paperclipped the name of the North Florida reviewer. I'm the South Florida reviewer. I would love to receive any of your calls or questions, even though this is not my area, but I've attached the name of Andrew Weber, who covers North Florida. Does anyone have any other questions? Well, thank you for your time.
Oh, I remember that, yes, I remember that story.
Sausage you can move, it turn off. And then you have it every month. You guys require
It's
40
starting to move.
a year. We have it every month.
Where's the, they, you know, they have big cats and then they have skinny cats. And they have. Well, this is probably the ordinance. I think you're receiving Tallahassee.
We're ready. Okay. All right, so for this part of the training, I'm going to talk a lot less, and you are going to have an opportunity to talk. So we're going to talk about design review, and for those of you that are on a historic preservation commission or board, this is really what the focus of your meetings probably revolve around. So when you have locally designated properties that are in a district or individually locally designated, your ordinance requires that for certain repairs, major repairs, so anything above ordinary maintenance, needs to come before the board to make sure that those changes are appropriate, historically appropriate. So in order to do that, we kind of need to talk about character-defining features and how to analyze buildings. So for those of you that are not on a historic commission, I think that you'll probably still enjoy this part of the presentation because we're just going to look at buildings and analyze them for what it is about them that defines their character, what it is that makes them historic, and what kinds of changes would negatively impact that building's historic character. So, purpose of design review, it's to protect listed properties. It's protection. It's to effectively manage the use and reuse of historic buildings. It's to educate people. For communities that have design guidelines to help property owners make positive changes or to make appropriate changes to their historic structures, design guidelines are really a form of education. And the information that you give folks when they come to your meetings is a form of education. So just keep that in mind. And it's also to comply with federal, state, and local preservation requirements. But really, the purpose of design review is to ensure that any project involving a designated property is planned to protect the integrity, aka historic character, of the property. So if you have a folder or if you picked up the handouts, you have a document that has 17 in the corner, and it's a preservation brief. The National Park Service has published a number of different preservation briefs that are basically best practices for maintaining historic properties. And I am referencing Preservation Brief 17 when we talk about character-defining features. And if you ever want to take a look at the other preservation briefs, they are all available online. Uh-oh. Whoop. All right, so here on the screen, I have a couple of elements that we're going to use in some subsequent examples. So when looking at a historic building to try to figure out what its character-defining features are, you can look at its shape, its roof, and particular roof features. You can look at openings like windows and doors, projections like porches, trim and secondary features, those detail elements, the materials that were used to construct the building, and the setting that the building is in. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Here we have the Heiser House, which is listed on the National Register. And using the criteria I have here on the side, I'm opening the floor. I want you to describe some of the character-defining features of this building. So instead of looking at the building as a whole, look at the pieces that that define its character. And don't worry about using architectural terms. You can say roof thingy, whatever you see. A gable front. Low roof. This is a 1 or a 1 and I think it's just a 1-story. It does have a screened-in porch, so that's its projection. Thick columns. I think that's stucco on brick.
It doesn't have an enclosed eave.
All the eaves are open. There, it has some side gables on the back portion of the house, and those are open. They are not enclosed.
Can't tell what that siding is.
It is wood siding.
Yeah, it looks like old wood slat siding.
Are we talking about everything or just the shape?
Or just what?
Just the shape or all the?
Everything. Oh yeah, sorry. You can go through all of these
Yeah.
natural wood windows and doors.
What's that, 8 light?
Mm-hmm.
Translator.
Mm-hmm. I think we have 9/1 windows on the right side of the building.
The supporting projected beams and other beams, the joists that come out, that probably shape. Could come out from the gable and also then on the end of the slopes.
There's some exposed bracketing a little bit. Anything else?
Is it T-shape or L-shape?
I am honestly not sure.
Setting looks like a country setting,
Mhm.
big oak tree in front,
Mm-hmm.
some around on the side. It's a strong horizontal.
Yes, this is a horizontally laid out building, not vertically. So if you were to put a rooftop addition on this building, that would definitely impact that horizontal character defining feature, and it would dramatically change its character.
Concrete steps with sides, what do you call it?
I'm not
Just jump off them on the ground. Things on either side of the steps.
All right.
And I would say that we can only see the front of the building, but
Mhm.
there's lots of windows, doors that open up,
Mm-hmm.
because in Florida, a house, you didn't have air conditioning, you needed to open up the house to air move through.
Mm-hmm.
Tropical setting.
Mm-hmm.
Architecture across. The doors to the left of the front door are French doors that were probably added.
Possibly.
One original to the house.
Mhm. So we've listed a number of these features that define the building's character, and I mentioned how a rooftop addition would impact the character-defining feature of this building being very horizontal in nature. Can you think of other changes that might impact the character of this building that you would say no to as a member of a Historic Preservation Commission? Closing in the porch. Vinyl siding. Changing it to like a metal seam roof when it's asphalt shingles.
Would that change it? 'Cause
It depends what it was historically. I don't know if that would have
A lot of metal roofing.
many houses, but probably not a Craftsman or bungalow like this.
shingle roofing is typical for this.
It would depend. I haven't read the National Register nomination for this one, so I can't recall if the shingle roofing was the original construction material or not.
If you change the piers, the columns.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's go to another example of a different kind of building. Here we have a theater. Any character defining features? Mm-hmm. The marquee, definitely. That shows you what. Mm-hmm. The ticket window, definitely someone mentioned the marquee and the ticket window. Those are very character defining features that tell you what this building was.
Do you know whether this building had originally been a theater?
Yes, it was. This one's in Georgia, by the way. It is to the right of that main entrance. Anything else? Mm-hmm. The primary entrance is in the center, but I believe that one of those goes to like a snack bar, and I can't remember what the other one goes to, but there are entrances and exits to separate spaces. They probably were originally. I can't tell if they've been replaced. I hope not. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering whether it looks like it could be ironwork.
Mm-hmm. Underneath the windows?
I'm wondering whether that's original.
I'm not sure.
I'm like the little Juliet thing, Juliet Falcon. Is that is coming out.
I like the colors. I like the fact that they've accented the architectural details.
Mm-hmm. And that brings up a great point. She said she likes the colors. So this historic district and most historic districts do not regulate paint color. What they do regulate is if the building was not painted and has not been painted, that you don't paint it. But if it's already been painted, then you can really go wild with the colors if your community does not regulate paint color. All right. So these are the Bacardi Buildings, and they're actually situated on one site on like a plaza. And Max actually wrote the National Register nomination for these buildings. So if you have questions about it, ask him all about it.
Yesterday or today.
So this is now on the National Register.
So when were these built?
These were built in the 1960s to 1970s.
When they left Cuba?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So what do we see as character-defining features in these buildings? Yeah, the left one is stained glass, right? And then the one on the right is porcelain. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the one.
Basically, the building on the right, on each side of the building, there are what they're called azulejo tiles that make up this tens of thousands of what they call their shipped from Brazil.
Wow. And on the left is
Left one, those are four walls, all made entirely of stained glass.
really?
Yes.
Wow. Cool.
The volume on the top is larger than that.
Mm-hmm. You have that recessed base.
What do they use that building for on the left? What was that?
These were both office buildings, but they're currently owned by a nonprofit that works with artistic kids.
So the building on the right definitely emphasizes verticality, and the building on the left, horizontality.
The glass wall on the taller building. I think it's no roof that projects up.
Mm-hmm. In terms of setting, this was designed with a big open plaza, and actually if you look on Google Maps, like the Google satellite, you'll see they have the Bacardi symbol like embedded in the plaza. So you would certainly adversely affect the setting in terms of character defining features if you were to fill that plaza up with something that detracted from it. All right, so all right, so now instead of looking at one individual building, we're going to look at these 4 commercial buildings together. So what are the character defining features of these buildings together as a block? These are in Rome, Georgia.
Well, that they share walls.
Mm-hmm.
They have the same type of store front. Big windows, recessed doors.
Mm-hmm.
They got 3 windows in each building.
Yeah, they each basically have 3 primary bays. They,
And then the smaller windows on the top.
mm-hmm,
And they're flush
mm-hmm, they'll have the same setback.
width-wise with the same height.
Mm-hmm.
Cornices.
So if one of these buildings, God forbid, was torn down, we probably wouldn't want to see a 3-story put in its place because it would interrupt the rhythm.
It doesn't look like there's been any alterations to the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of, they hadn't put a new facade on.
Mm-hmm. All right. How about these 3 houses? Mm-hmm. Gable facing front with a porch. They are on pier foundations. I think they all have metal roofs, but I'm not sure about the middle one. They all have a pretty deep setback from the street. They don't have paved driveways. Anything else?
With paving the driveway impact aesthetic in your opinion?
It would depend who you ask. It would depend what your design guidelines say. You'll see actually what they did with this house, but I think what their Historic Preservation Commission decided was appropriate was gravel. So kind of depends. So let's focus on the house on the right. We have these 3 houses in a row. The owner of the house on the right comes before your board, and they have some changes that they'd like to make while they rehabilitate the house. And so the things that they're proposing are they need to replace some of the CMU piers because some of them are no longer structurally sound. They want to replace the windows. They want to replace the front door. They want to replace damaged siding. And they want to add a wood picket fence to the front. And they also want to add a screened-in porch at the rear. So before we make any judgments on these changes, do we have any questions about the changes that might impact what you would say? Is the rear addition visible from the street? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, yes. So this is after rehabilitation began. So they'd already removed the fence on that encloses the front porch. But when I say picket fence, they actually want to have a little picket fence that juts out into the yard that's not covered. So I'll just give you a little more information. The concrete masonry unit pier, concrete masonry unit piers, they said that they would make sure to differentiate the appearance so that you would know which of the piers were original and which were not. They are only going to replace damaged sidings, and they're going to leave all of the historic siding alone that isn't damaged. The front door is not a historic door, so they are going to reference the design guidelines to make sure that the front door matches what would have been common on shotgun houses when they were built. And as the windows are also not original, are not historic, the boards simply asked them to make sure that they were 1/1 windows, which is what was common. So what do we think? This is what it looks like when they finished. They did. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Overall, though, do we feel like they maintained the historic character of the building and their rehabilitation? Mm-hmm.
Front door, is there a leaded or stained glass type window in that glass?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think that the instructions that the board gave them was that for the front door, they wanted it to have a glass window, but they didn't really specify exactly what it would look like.
Yeah, that's what I've seen too many times where they'll get a fancy door and they put those kind in and it just don't fit the house. So I would hope that they would not approve that, they would suggest they have plain glass. Or a glass you couldn't see through or something, but not a stained or leaded glass.
All right, any other thoughts about this one? Any questions? All right, so we're going to talk briefly about the Secretary of the Interior standards, and many of you may be familiar with these. The standards were created to help guide people when they pursue preservation, restoration, rehabilitation, or reconstruction projects, and I'll just briefly define the difference. Generally, when folks come before your board, they are coming forth with a rehabilitation project because that is the most flexible type of project that allows you to adapt a building to be used in another way. Preservation is the strictest, where you just don't change anything. Restoration is when, let's say, a building had additions over time. You removed the additions and you brought the building back to what it originally looked like, even though the additions may have become historic in their own right. And then you have reconstruction, where a building was lost and it was completely reconstructed to look exactly like it did at a certain time. So again, what you're probably looking at as a board is rehabilitation. And when folks apply for federal tax credits for a rehabilitation project, the project is held to these standards when it's evaluated to make sure that the tax break was used in order to really facilitate a good rehabilitation project. Yes?
You said back to when it was originally built, it says here the specific time period, so could you...
Which one are you talking about? Oh, restoration? So it totally depends. I mean, if they want to restore it to the beginning, if they want to take a building back to what it looked like when it was first constructed, that is restoration. If they want to take it back to what it looked like 50 years ago, that's also restoration. It's when you're trying to basically move the clock back to get the building to look like a certain period of time. So if you want to see a more in-depth description of the Secretary of the Interior standards, I'm going to go through a brief version. You can go to the National Park Service website, and they have a fairly long PDF document with lots and lots of examples. So what I'm about to do is just kind of a basic primer. But the main ideas of the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation are that you retain and restore historic fabric and features, that you retain historic character, which we're all now experts in, and that you make changes that are compatible and also reversible. All right, so the first standard, this is basically the adaptive reuse standard. A property shall be used for its historic purpose or be placed in a new use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building and its site and environment. So here I have 3 examples of adaptive reuse projects in which the buildings once had one very specific purpose and now have a completely different purpose, but their characteristics, their defining characteristics were not changed in the process. So top left, you have the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mills in Atlanta, Georgia. No longer a mill, but you can't tell that from the outside necessarily because they followed the rehabilitation standards, and that's actually now been developed into residential lofts. It's a cool building. If you go to Atlanta, you should go see it, and the neighborhood that surrounds it is at the old mill village, and so there's lots of shotgun houses and mill houses and all that. No, the neighborhood's called Cabbage Town. They don't know why it's called that. They have theories. They don't know. In the middle, this one's actually in Tallahassee. This was an old gas station, an auto parts store, and they've turned it into like a bar / meeting space. Probably wouldn't have had turf grass as a gas station, but that's okay. It's reversible. And so that's a creative adaptive reuse project for that building. And then on the bottom right, this was actually in Pennsylvania. It's an old fire station that's been converted into a restaurant. but it still has like the fire poles inside, and they have all kinds of equipment all over the walls. But all three of these are really great examples where they maintained the historic character of the building, but also found a way to reuse it. All right, the second standard, the historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved. The removal of historic materials or alteration of features and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided. And the picture, the example that I have here on this slide, has made two major errors that have negatively impacted the historic character of the building. Can anybody spot them? They painted it. It went over 100 years without being painted, and then they painted it.
The awning, actually the awning detracts the fact that it's gone.
So you're both touching on the same thing. What they did was, if you can, it's hard to see on the slide, I apologize. It originally had a recessed entryway, which most late 19th and early 20th century commercial buildings did, and they completely tore it out. And they reinstalled a nice flush facade. So, you know, I mean, the recessed entryway is certainly a character-defining feature of these commercial buildings, so that is something that you want to retain, and was not in this case. All right, the third standard, each property shall be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or architectural elements from other buildings, shall not be undertaken. So one example that you might see is like if it was a really simple vernacular house that was devoid of ornamentation for most of its lifetime, and then the new person who buys it, renovates it, and decides they'll put gingerbread trim on it. That was not a historic part of that building, and that is really trying to convey that it's, you know, like a Victorian or Queen, has this Queen Anne elements, when that was not necessarily what it was. And then here, the example I have on the screen, you see that cornice line that sticks out, and then there's 2 stories above it. Those 2 stories were originally in the design for the building, but were never constructed. So for the majority of its lifetime, this building did not have those 2 upper stories. But then within recent years, they constructed them as if they were there the entire time. So conveying a false sense of historical development. Standard 4, most properties change over time. Those changes that have acquired historic significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved. So on this one, we're looking at that building in the middle that says Partridge Restaurant and has what looks to be green sheet metal on the outside. And this building was originally a brick commercial building, just like those on either side of it. And in the 1930s, somebody bought it and converted it into a movie theater. And they wanted it to have a more modern appearance. So they put that green facade, I'm not sure what the material is, on the storefront, and then they put the sheet metal over the brick, and then they added some kind of spire on the top that may or may not have been an antenna. But for the last 80 years, this is what that building has looked like. This appearance has become historic in its own right. So this is kind of a challenging example, you know. What if a new person purchased this building and came before your board and wanted to remove the green siding? It's a challenge. What narrative, what historical narrative do you choose? Is it the late 19th century brick commercial building, or is it the 1930s modern movie theater? There are certainly challenges. All right, standard 5, distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a historic property shall be preserved. So this one's pretty straightforward. If there is clear evidence, clear design choices that were the work of a craftsman of some sort, so here we have some bas relief and carvings and all that, these are elements that you'd want to preserve. Standard 6, deteriorated historic features shall be repaired rather than replaced. So in the example of the shotgun house, they wanted to replace some of the siding that had deteriorated. Generally, what is considered appropriate is to replace just the deteriorated pieces rather than wholesale replacing all of the wooden siding. And I put the picture of a window here. Windows come up for debate quite a bit on historic preservation commissions. People love to replace their windows, and really they can be salvaged a lot more than people think. So trying to repair and replace them using storm windows and other options to try to keep those historic windows. Standard 7, this is the no sandblasting rule. Chemical or physical treatments such as sandblasting that cause damage to historic materials shall not be used. The surface cleaning of structures, if appropriate, shall be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. When you sandblast, or let me back up, when the brick was made, when it was fired, the outside of the brick is the hardest, strongest part of the brick. When you sandblast it, you take that outer layer off, leaving the softer inner part of the brick exposed, which will rapidly deteriorate, which can compromise your historic structure. So no sandblasting.
You're also blowing away the ground.
Blowing away the grout, correct. Yes, do not use Portland cement. It is stronger than the soft brick and can make it spall, which means it pops out. Standard 8, significant archaeological resources affected by a project shall be protected and preserved. If resources must be disturbed, mitigation measures shall be undertaken. And I have two examples here of Florida projects. The left is in Miami, and the one on the right, I just blanked. This one was like in the 80s. This was a neighborhood residential development. I can't remember. But both of these projects were development projects that uncovered archaeological remains. And so, let me see if I have it right here. This was the Wendover Farms subdivision in Titusville, the one on the right. All right, Standard 9, and we're going to spend a little extra time on Standards 9 and 10 because they're challenges that historic preservations often face, and that is of how to handle new additions and new construction in historic districts. So Standard 9, new additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction shall not destroy historic materials that characterize the property. The new work shall be differentiated from the old and shall be compatible with the massing, size, scale, and architectural features to protect the historic integrity of the property and its environment. So if you look at our example here, the large section of the building on the left is the original portion of the building. That center section that's all glass is what we call a hyphen. So this is what connects the original building to the new addition. And then on the right-hand side, we have the new addition. So what they did in this case is they made the addition smaller than the main building. They used similar materials so that it was compatible, but they definitely made it so that it didn't dwarf the original building. It does not in any way detract from the main building. And then the use of the hyphen is actually twofold. One, it kind of makes you pause between the two pieces, but also the way that it's constructed is to causes minimal damage as humanly possible to the other structure, so that if you removed it, where it connected would not have destroyed the historic material. All right, Standard 10, new additions and adjacent or related new construction shall be undertaken in such a manner that if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment would be unimpaired. And this is just, in general, a good rule of thumb with any kind of rehabilitation project. Is a major change reversible? How would it affect the historic structure if it was removed at a later date? This one? No, this one is actually in the preservation brief that I'm going to pull out for you. All right, so if you have a folder or if you picked it up in the back, preservation brief 14, this one is focused on new exterior additions to historic buildings. And this example actually came out of here. It may say where it was, but it is not in Florida. It doesn't say. Correct, yeah, this addition's in the back so that if you were in the front of the house, you would not see it from the street. And it also has a hyphen. It's hard to see, but they have a little hyphen connecting it. All right, so we're going to do some more examples in a second with additions and new construction, but I want to give you some considerations to think about for when you analyze them. So consider if removing the consider if the addition is going to cause the removal or damage to historic materials and the character-defining features. We're always thinking about the character-defining features and how they'll be impacted. Think about the placement or the location of the addition. You know, we just talked about how the last example on the screen, they put the addition in the rear so that it would not be visible from the street and not detract from the historic portion of the building. You want to consider if the addition will be differentiated but also compatible and harmonious. So we talked about the use of separating with a connector or a hyphen. The first example, they differentiated the addition in size and scale and massing, but they did a similar color. They used the same materials. And you also want to think about the impact on the site and setting. Lastly, inherent in all of the guidance is the concept that an addition needs to be subordinate to the historic building.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment on that, because we were talking about the massing. I'm thinking of an example in Sarasota,
Mm-hmm.
where the historic building was a mid-century modern one-story house, and the owners created a 2 or 3 story massive structure and kept the historic house, I guess, in defense of them, right, as the pool house. So, yeah, I know, but, you know, again, you kind of have to come down on which side, you know, they didn't demolish the
Right.
historic building, but under these guidelines, certainly the scale and massing has changed dramatically.
And it's in a historic district.
I don't know that it is.
Yeah.
It's in a area down there which is very famous called Lido Shores, which has an amazing variety of both mid-century modern and contemporary modern structures. So, you know, they gave a nod to the original building and didn't destroy it, but certainly it's dwarfed by the construction.
Yeah, you definitely have to think about the impact that your addition visually is going to have on the original structure. But yeah, I guess kudos to them for keeping the original, even as a pool house. All right, here's our example.
Mansion, the whole thing is on.
Yes, definitely better than that. Here's our example. The owner of this house has come before your board because they want to make some additions. But before we talk about that, what are the character defining features of this house? Has that front gable, projecting porch. Mm-hmm. It is elevated. It has, I think, piers, but they haven't filled in the foundation. They have that lattice work instead. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It is a corner lot. So here's the side of it. Corner lot is a challenge with additions because there are more vantage points with which to view the house. I picked a hard one on purpose. All right, here are the plans for the additions. So they want to put a small addition to the left and a slightly larger addition to the right. They have recessed them beneath the roof line. What do you think? Mm-hmm. Certainly makes it much longer. Yeah, it's going to affect the setting because more of the setting is going to be taken up by the additions.
If you're gonna add that many square feet, it's probably as new as you could get. But I guess the question is it appropriate to add that much square feet to a home of that size?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then what the setbacks are for all of the community, because that's a lot of principally, the sort of floor area ratio of our,
Mm-hmm. So they made some effort to differentiate them so that at least you knew that they were additions and that they were not a part of the original structure. I don't know what kind of considerations they took when, in terms of if you removed the additions at a later date, if the main structure would be heavily damaged.
Your roof line on the primary section would change that dramatically. If they had
Mm-hmm.
just gone off to the side but kept that gable front,
Mm-hmm.
they would have changed the
Yep.
kept the gable front, but look at the whole, look at the massive roof in that.
Oh, I should mention, does this have a lighter? Well, there is a small addition in the back that I'm not sure we could see Yeah, we couldn't see it from here, but there's a very small addition on the back existing. So, I mean, what would you, any thoughts on what you would do if you saw this? What would you say? I'm not sure if that. So actually, I do remember this from the notes. They did ask them. I don't know if they changed the height of that gable front, but they did ask them to do the siding instead of the shingles, I believe, on that gable front. One does wonder if it would be possible to do a larger addition on the rear instead of the sides like that. But again, it's a corner lot, so. Mm-hmm.
Instead of the siding that's on, that matches, they have a siding a little different.
Mm-hmm. Differentiate the siding a little bit, sure. All right, so now we're going to talk about new construction. Some considerations. If there's a vacant lot in a historic district and someone comes before you with a proposal to build a new building on that lot in a historic district, consider the architectural styles that are in the neighborhood already and how that new construction would be compatible or not. The rhythm of the street, the scale, height of buildings, if they're oriented to the road, if they're oriented to the side, setbacks, is there a consistent setback among all the houses on that street? And then are there common details and materials within the buildings on the block? So we're going to do an example. Here we have a little house. It's on a corner lot. Love those corner lots. Here it is facing the street. And well, it's actually facing Robson, but the side street is Kirkwood. This is an Atlanta example.
So the face is not to Kirkwood.
No, it faces Robson.
So whatever they build is going to block the face of the existing house.
I'm not sure what you mean.
As it's situated.
Oh, sorry. This building, a tree fell on it. This building, this example is that a tree falls on this building, it's demolished, and someone wants to build something on this site. Didn't clarify that, sorry. So we're going to look at the block. We're going to look at all the houses down the street. Tell me the character defining features that are in common on this street.
And facing forward.
Mm-hmm.
Porches, setback,
Mm-hmm.
overall style.
Mm-hmm.
It gives variety to the
Generally the same architectural style, generally same materials, same setback. They're all horizontal in nature. I believe there were 1 or 1.5 stories. I'm not positive. And then up on the top left, you can see our little house, but we'll look at it one more time. The tree falls down, the house is gone, somebody wants to construct something on it. Is this what you pictured? Why not? It's 2 stories, so it interrupts that flow down the street. Correct? This, no, it's like they tried a little bit with the columns a little bit and some of the brackets, although most of these houses don't have the brackets. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it draws your eyes there. Your eyes are now on this new construction, and everything else is now subordinate.
I lived in Bethesda when they started tearing down houses and building these big mansions, and they just blew over the original homes in the neighborhood. I mean, really even,
Mm-hmm.
like these people are looking down on them.
They've also removed a lot of the landscaping that was there originally.
Well, yeah.
That was nice, lush, and added, I think, to the character of the neighborhood.
Trees going because it's going out.
Yep. And you see how it impacted the street? Because when you drive past the street, it's the corner lot. That's what you see. But luckily, you guys are in a position as members of historic preservation commissions to see these drawings for new construction and to try to make suggestions about how the building would flow better with the rest of the historic district.
I know that saying this and it goes against the whole idea that everything is supposed to look alike, but we also, when we're talking about Ethiopian, it's Main Street,
Mm-hmm.
and some of its character is the fact that it reflects decades
Definitely.
in the town.
Mm-hmm.
So to not, I think maybe be tempered some
Mm-hmm.
about everything looking just like that.
Well, it's like the Secretary standard that we talked about creating a false sense of history. You would not want to build a building on this lot that directly mirrors those down the street from it so that you couldn't tell that it was new. You want it to be differentiated in some way. But the key is you don't want it to be so different that it sticks out like a sore thumb and detracts from the rest of the historic resources.
Do you think because it was on the corner lot that they felt they could get away with the two-story rather than a single story? If it were in the middle of those others, it would be.
It's possible. It may have slightly more acreage than the others do, and they wanted to maximize.
I think part of it has been driven by the builder wanting to maximize the value.
Mm-hmm.
Also, same house, it looks like there's much less front yard in that.
It's just.
It's the same one.
But, my thing is this a historic district or are the houses within it registered historic independently?
So that's a great question. This is a National Register Historic District, but it is not a locally registered historic district. So these properties are not regulated.
There you go.
Yep.
So it's state, right?
No, they're not regulated.
This is not regulated. So the neighbor,
He had every right to build that house.
Exactly.
there.
And no local historic board.
correct, not for this neighborhood, because this neighborhood is not locally designated. Luckily, it's hard to find examples of this happening in local districts because that means the historic preservation commissions are doing their job. All right, so I want to talk briefly about design guidelines, and we're almost finished. So your local ordinances have some guidelines for you to follow when you are doing design review for properties that are locally designated. But I just want to really push that if you don't have design guidelines, I highly recommend that you look into creating them. So I have Gainesville's mid-century design guidelines. I think Gainesville actually has several sets of design guidelines, and they're based by neighborhood, I believe. St. Augustine has multiple sets of design guidelines, but some folks will do them for individual neighborhoods. Well, here at Lake Worth did the entire city, and this is a beast, but it is incredibly thorough, and this is a great resource not only for Historic Preservation Commission members in trying to make decisions about design review, but also for the owners to be knowledgeable about the history of their community, how their neighborhood developed, what materials were used, what kinds of changes would be appropriate. Usually these include the Secretary of the Interior standards so that people have that as a tool. But if you want to take a look at these, I have these, and you're more than welcome to look at them. And a lot of them can also be found online. I have a spreadsheet that has all of our certified local governments, and it includes all of those who have design guidelines. So I can send that to anyone who'd like to see that and look through different communities' design guidelines. This is from the St. Petersburg Design Guidelines. I just wanted to show you how they used historic postcards to illustrate the development of their neighborhood. Mm-hmm.
We have a person in Gainesville.
Mm-hmm.
You know how much it costs to develop a job? I do not. I only know after a couple months.
Fun fact, this was financed using a grant. So this was a small matching grant, and as a CLG, their match was waived.
That was actually a partnership between the city, the university, and Gainesville Modern, which is a small nonprofit.
Was that this one, or was this the one that did the statewide survey of modern resources? It was this one? Okay, awesome.
We just applied for a follow-up grant.
Awesome. Anyone else? Did you? All right. So that's it. If you want a digital copy of this presentation, you can feel free to email me, or if you want Max's, you can email Max. But does anyone have any questions at this point? Well, thank you for coming out and spending your evening with us. I hope that this was somewhat informative. And again, just feel free to reach out with me if you have any questions at any point about certified local governments, historic preservation, whatever. But have a good night.